Let's talk about global illumination in Unreal Engine 5. In the post-process volume, this is where you're going to control your global illumination or your GI most of the time. So if I select my post-process volume and I scroll down, I hide all of my other tools, we have our global illumination settings. So generally speaking, the default out of the gate, out of the box, is going to be set to Lumen. And this is what it looks like. This is our Lumen scene. And I have my frame rate right here. Now, the reason why I have my frame rate, and I'm making this relevant, is the more rays and the more stuff that is affecting our global illumination, the harder that our performance is going to get hit. So right now we're around 60, 70 frames per second for this scene that I have. But if I were to set this over to ray tracing, for example, we're going to actually increase some frames right here. But the problem is that I actually turned off global illumination. And the reason why is we have this ray tracing setting right here. And if I set this type to brute force, we can see that we're going to lose some performance now because we're adding ray traced global illumination to our scene. So why am I sharing all of this? Well, global illumination is basically when a light hits an object, then we will get some reflection of that light bouncing off of that object. And that's what GI is creating. It's the effect where if a sunlight hits an object, it's going to sort of bounce around the scene. And for your scene, the look that you're going for might get better results under different scenarios. So it's always worth asking, why am I using a certain tool and what is the look I'm going for? So for this scene, I actually would render this out with Lumen. Now, the first thing we need to acknowledge is the way the lighting is changing around the scene. So it's important to understand that while we are setting our global illumination settings in our post-process volume, if we go to another light in our scene like this directional light, that is the light that's contributing all this light over on the left side of the frame. So in an effort to demonstrate the render settings that you would get out of the box with default Unreal Engine render settings, we are getting this kind of look with Lumen. So this is the first render, and then the second render here that you're looking at currently is with path tracing. Now this is the most realistic lighting, but it will be the longest to render. Now the last two that you are looking at are with ray trace settings. We can see on the left side of the frame on that shelf there's a lot more brightness in the global illumination. To help clean up some of the reflections and noise in the scene, I rendered out a second pass of ray tracing with some more samples, but it did take a little bit longer to render. Now these renders that I did previously to try and demonstrate the scene, it really brought up the brightness of this shelf here, and a friend of mine called out that this actually looked worse. I showed these renders to a couple friends of mine, and they're like, oh yeah, some of these will look great, perfect, and then others were like, this is weird, why is that? Well, GI is basically taking illumination from lights in your scene and amplifying it. And if we scroll up in the directional light settings, there's a setting called Indirect Lighting Intensity, and that's basically saying while this light is not hitting a source directly, the indirect brightness is a certain amount. And right now the default is set to 1, but if I set this to 0, it's going to have this light not contribute to global illumination at all. So if we go into our post-process volume settings and we adjust our global illumination settings, we really brought down the brightness of this shelf by bringing down the indirect lighting intensity, but now there's no light source on it all, so it really is falling off into darkness. And we could very well just try and add some of these settings, but it's not going to really do much. We can even go into the ray trace global illumination, go to the advanced, and try and crank this up, and we're getting a little bit around here, around the rest of the scene, but the directional light is no longer contributing to that indirect lighting intensity, even though we're adjusting this slider. Now I could go into the directional light and let's say set this back to 1. If I go into my indirect lighting intensity right there, and then I go back to my post-process volume, find my global illumination settings, and try and adjust this and try and get the look that I want, but I have other lights in my scene that are contributing RGI in a different way. So this is a situation where if you need to add GI to your scene, you need to push and pull. And in this scenario, I would actually keep this indirect lighting intensity at 1, but then I'd go to the directional light and then maybe I'd set this value to like 0.1, maybe 0.2, 0.4. And that looks a little bit more natural. Versus if I kick this back over to Lumen, quick rewind, I did do a little boo-boo when I went to the post-process volume and I tried to set it to Lumen. I accidentally hit none. But now if I go into that directional lighting and I try and adjust this indirect lighting intensity, we're getting a different look and effect. So what I'm trying to say, and at the end of this video, you should take away this. If you're trying to adjust your post-process volume, global illumination, these settings will affect your scene globally, but some lights might need to be adjusted manually. Last thing I will say is that in general and on average with global illumination and reflections, it's a good idea to get them to match, and here's why. If I set this global illumination to ray tracing, this reflection right here in this mirror ball is going to get weird and gross, and like we're losing a lot of detail. Versus if we go to Lumen here and then set my reflections to ray tracing, hey, we're getting a really good looking result here, but I can't speak on behalf of whether this is technically correct, but when you mix and match, you might get weird and interesting results. That is what I'm trying to say, and it really depends on your scene. What is the look that you're going for, and how will it affect the cinematic story you are trying to tell? So I will leave the video here. I hope you learned something about Unreal Engine 5 Global Illumination. Words are hard. If you learned something, let me know in the comment section down below. If you have questions, comments, concerns, whatever else, comment section is down there for that as well. And I will leave you with the final tip, and that is to eat 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, and you'll make some. Goodbye, my friends. Bye.